They were about to hang her for a crime no one could name. And the only thing louder than the crowd was the silence in her eyes, the kind of silence that didn't beg, didn't break, didn't belong to someone guilty. Dust drifted across the square in slow spirals under a hard western sun. Boots shuffled, voices rose and fell like heat off dry ground. And above it all stood Iona Red Hawk, hands bound, shoulders steady, the rope resting against her collarbone like it had already decided her fate. She didn't look at the sheriff, didn't look at the people calling for judgment. She looked somewhere beyond them, somewhere older than the town, older than the wooden beams and the cracked well and the crooked church bell that hadn't rung right in years, as if whatever she saw out there mattered more than what was about to happen here. A man near the front spat into the dirt and muttered something about justice, but it didn't sound like justice. It sounded like fear dressed up in louder clothes. The sheriff wiped sweat from his neck, though the wind had a bite to it. His fingers hovered near the lever like he was waiting for someone else to make the decision for him. Anyone else. Because deep down, even he knew this wasn't something you could undo once done. And still the crowd pressed forward, hungry not for truth, but for closure, the kind that comes quick and leaves a stain no one talks about later. Somewhere at the edge of it all, a horse slowed to a stop, hooves sinking softly into the dust. The rider didn't rush, didn't shout, didn't reach for a weapon. He just sat there for a moment, watching, like a man trying to understand a story that didn't add up. Ethan Cole had seen enough of the frontier to recognize the difference between guilt and silence. And what stood on that platform wasn't the kind that came from doing wrong. It was the kind that came from being misunderstood. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud, the sound barely noticed over the rising voices. But something shifted anyway, subtle, like the wind changing direction before a storm. Ethan stepped forward, not fast, not slow, just steady, his eyes moving from face to face, measuring, weighing, remembering, because he had reasons, more than most, to believe the worst about people like her, reasons carved into memory and loss in years that didn't give anything back, and yet something in the way she stood there refused to fit inside that belief, refused to make it easy. A flicker of silver caught the light at her throat, small, almost hidden beneath dust and shadow, but enough to pull his gaze closer, enough to make his breath pause for half a second longer than it should have. The sheriff cleared his throat, voice tight, announcing something about order and law, but the words felt thin, like paper in a storm. Ethan kept walking, each step quiet, deliberate, closing the distance between doubt and decision. The crowd noticed now, voices dipping, turning, curiosity replacing certainty in uneven waves. No one stopped him, not because they agreed, but because no one was sure they should be the one to try. Iona's eyes shifted then, just slightly, meeting his for the first time, and in that moment there was no accusation there, no plea, just recognition of something neither of them could yet name, something that hung in the space between two worlds that had never learned how to listen to each other. The sheriff hesitated, fingers tightening, waiting for a signal that didn't come. Ethan stopped a few feet from the platform, the dust settling around his boots, the sun pressing down harder, as if the sky itself was watching. And for a long second, no one moved, not the crowd, not the sheriff, not even the wind. And in that stillness, the story everyone thought they knew began to crack, just a little, just enough to let something else in, something quieter, something heavier, something that didn't need a voice to be heard. The first man to look away did it slowly, like he hoped no one would notice, his hat dipping just enough to break eye contact. And that was all it took for the air to change, not louder, not softer, just different, like something unseen had stepped into the space between them. Ethan Cole did not turn to the crowd. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the gun at his hip. Instead, he kept his eyes on Iona Red Hawk, studying the way she held herself, as if the rope meant less to her than the truth no one had asked for. There was dust on her face, faint lines where sweat had carved paths through it. And still she stood straighter than anyone in that square. The sheriff cleared his throat again, louder this time, trying to pull control back into his hands, saying something about order and how things had to be done. But his voice carried less weight now, like it no longer belonged to him. Ethan took one more step forward, then another, the wooden boards of the platform creaking softly under his boots as he climbed up, the sound sharp in the quiet. And for a moment the sheriff shifted, uncertain, as if he might speak again, but the words did not come. Ayanna watched Ethan approach without moving, her eyes steady, unreadable, not afraid, not hopeful, just present, like she had already accepted whatever came next long before anyone else arrived. Ethan stopped an arm's length away, close enough to see the fine stitching on the silver pendant at her throat, close enough to notice how carefully it had been kept despite everything else. His hand lifted slightly, then paused, hovering in the space between them, not touching, not yet. Like even this small movement carried more weight than it should. The crowd murmured behind him, restless now, uncertain, some whispering that he should step back, others saying nothing at all, because something in the way he stood there made speaking feel like the wrong choice. The sheriff swallowed hard and shifted his stance, one hand still near the lever, the other resting against his belt, waiting for Ethan to do something that could be named, something that could be judged, but Ethan did not give him that. Instead he spoke, quiet enough that only those closest could hear, but clear enough that the words carried. What did she do? The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and somehow heavier than all the shouting that had come before it. No one answered right away. A man near the front cleared his throat, muttered something about stolen horses. Another said something about trouble in the hills, but the stories did not line up. They slipped against each other, thin and uncertain, like they had been borrowed instead of lived. Ethan listened, his gaze never leaving Ayanna, and then he asked again, slower this time. What did she do? The silence that followed was different from before, not empty, but exposed, like the truth had been standing there all along and no one wanted to be the one to point at it. Ayanna's voice came then, low, steady, not raised to defend, not sharpened to argue, just offered. I crossed your land. That was all. The words were simple, but they carried something else beneath them, something older, something that did not fit inside the rules of the town. A few people shifted uncomfortably. One woman folded her arms tighter across her chest. Another looked down at her hands as if they had suddenly become more interesting than the scene in front of her. Ethan's eyes flicked once to the sheriff, then back to Ayanna. Crossing is not a crime, he said, still quiet, still even. And this time the words did not just hang. They settled, heavy and undeniable. The sheriff opened his mouth, closed it again, then finally managed to say something about boundaries, about safety, about how things had been tense lately. But even he sounded like he was explaining it to himself. Ethan nodded once, as if he had heard enough, as if the pieces had already fallen into place, and then his hand moved, slow, deliberate, reaching for the rope at Ayanna's neck, not pulling, not jerking, just resting there for a second, feeling the rough fibers beneath his fingers, the kind of rope used for work, for holding things together, not for deciding who deserved to stay and who did not. The crowd held its breath, every eye fixed on that small point of contact, waiting for something to happen that would make sense of everything. Ethan did not look at them. He did not look at the sheriff. He only looked at the rope, and then at Ayanna. And in that quiet exchange something passed between them. Not words, not permission, something simpler, something that did not need to be spoken. And then, with the same calm he had carried since he stepped into the square, he began to lift at the rope shifted in Ethan Cole's hand, rising just an inch at first, then another, the fibers loosening from where they had rested against Ayanna Red Hawk's neck. And in that small movement something invisible broke across the square, not a sound, not a command, but a certainty that could not be undone. The sheriff's breath caught halfway between protest and silence, his fingers tightening against nothing, because there was no longer a moment to interrupt, only a moment to witness. Ethan did not rush. He did not look for approval. He simply lifted the rope free and let it hang in his hand like it had never belonged where it was placed. Ayanna did not move when it left her skin. She did not step back, did not reach up. She only inhaled slowly, as if the air itself felt different now. Heavier, more honest. The crowd shifted again, boots scraping against dry ground. Someone whispered that he had no right. Someone else said nothing at all. And that silence spread faster than any argument could, because deep down they all knew something had changed and none of them had the courage to name it. Ethan lowered the rope to his side, his hand still wrapped around it, not dropping it, not throwing it aside, just holding it like a reminder of what had almost been done. He turned then, Finally, his gaze moving across the faces in front of him, not accusing, not angry, just steady, and that steadiness unsettled them more than any raised voice ever could. "You all saw her," he said quietly, not asking, not demanding, just stating what was already true. She stood here and said nothing that sounded like guilt. The words were simple, but they landed with weight, pressing into the space where certainty had once been. A man near the front shook his head, muttering something about how things were not that simple, but his voice lacked the strength it had carried before, like it no longer believed itself. Ethan nodded slightly, as if he expected that, as if he had heard it all before in different towns with different names and the same kind of fear. "Things are rarely simple," he said, "but wrong is." The sentence hung there, quiet and unadorned, and for a moment no one moved. Not even the wind that had been drifting through the square all afternoon. The sheriff shifted his weight. Again, looking from Ethan to the crowd, searching for support that no longer stood where it had been minutes ago. His authority felt thinner now, stretched across too many doubts to hold firm. He cleared his throat, trying to gather himself, but the words came out slower, weaker, as if they had to push through something they did not understand. "Maybe we should reconsider," he said, not as a command, not as a declaration, but as a suggestion, and that alone told everyone how much had changed. Ayana's eyes moved then, not to the crowd, not to the sheriff, but back to Ethan, studying him with that same quiet intensity. And for the first time there was something else there, not relief, not gratitude, something deeper, something like recognition, as if she had seen this moment long before it arrived, as if she understood the cost of what he had done even if no one else did. Ethan glanced at the silver pendant again, the way it caught the light now that the rope no longer shadowed it, and a memory flickered behind his eyes, something distant, something he had buried under years of dust and distance. A woman's voice, soft, steady, telling him that not every story ends the way it begins. He exhaled slowly, the weight of that memory settling. Somewhere he could not ignore anymore. Then he stepped back from the platform. One step, then another, giving Ayana space that had been taken from her without reason. She did not move immediately, as if she was waiting to see if the moment would hold, if the silence would remain. And when it did, she reached up slowly, her fingers brushing the place where the rope had been, not in fear, not in disbelief, just acknowledgement. Like marking the line between what was and what would be. The crowd began to shift again, but this time it was different, not pressing forward, not demanding, but stepping back, small movements at first, a foot here, a glance there, the kind of retreat that happens when people realize they have been standing too close to something they do not understand. No one said they were wrong, no one apologized, but the space they created spoke louder than any words could. The sheriff lowered his hand from the lever, his shoulders dropping slightly, as if he had been holding something heavier than he realized. And for the first time since it all began, the square felt less like a place of judgment and more like a place where something had been corrected, not loudly, not completely, but enough to matter. Ethan stood at the base of the platform now, the rope still in his hand, looking at it for a long second before coiling it loosely, not as a tool, not as a symbol, just as something that no longer held the same meaning it had before. He did not speak again, did not look for thanks, did not wait for acknowledgement, because what needed to happen had already happened, and the rest belonged to the silence that followed. The kind of silence that does not end a story, but changes the way it continues. The town did not return to noise, not right away. It lingered in that strange, fragile quiet like something that might shatter if touched too quickly. A chair creaked somewhere near the saloon porch. A loose sign tapped softly against its nail, and even the wind seemed to move more carefully through the street, as if it had learned something from what had just happened. Ethan Cole stepped off the last board of the platform and onto the dust again, the rope now coiled in his hand. No longer a sentence, just a length of worn fiber that had forgotten its purpose. He did not look back up at Ayana Red Hawk. Not yet, because he understood something most men in that square did not, that some moments needed space to settle before they could be understood. Behind him, a few townsfolk shifted further away, widening the circle without admitting they were doing it. A man adjusted his hat lower over his eyes. Another picked up a bucket that did not need moving, small acts of retreat disguised as routine. The sheriff stepped forward slowly, his boots heavier now, as if each step had to pass through a question before it could land. He looked at the empty rope in Ethan's hand, then at Ayanna standing free above him, and something in his posture changed, not pride, not authority, something closer to relief, like a man who had been walking toward a line he did not want to cross and suddenly realized he no longer had to. "We will call this done," he said, his voice quieter than before, not announcing, not commanding, just placing the words into the air and letting them fall where they may. No one argued, not because they agreed, but because the argument had lost its ground. Ayanna remained still for a moment longer, feeling the weight of that decision settle around her. Then she lowered her hand slowly, the rope marks no longer pressing, her shoulders easing by a fraction that only someone watching closely would notice. She stepped forward, one careful step toward the edge of the platform, then another, her movements steady, unhurried, as if she refused to let this moment become anything rushed or stolen. When her boots touched the ground, the sound was soft, almost lost beneath the shifting dust, but it carried meaning all the same. Ethan finally turned then, his gaze meeting hers again, and for a brief second the rest of the world seemed to pull back, leaving only the space between them. No words passed, none were needed, because whatever had been decided on that platform had already been spoken in actions, not voices. Ayanna reached up to the pendant at her throat, her fingers brushing the cool metal. Then she did something unexpected. She stepped closer to Ethan, closing the distance the town had tried to force between them, and with a calm that carried more weight than any declaration, she slipped the pendant free from around her neck, the leather cord sliding over her hand. She held it out to him, not as a gift, not as a trade, but as something returned to where it belonged. Ethan's eyes dropped to it, the silver catching the light again, and this time the memory came clearer, not just a flicker, but a shape. A moment from years ago he had never fully understood, a woman lying under a thin blanket, her breathing shallow, her voice soft but certain as she told him about strangers who had shown her kindness when she had nothing left to give, strangers who did not look like him, did not speak like him, but chose to help anyway. He had been too young then to ask questions, too hurt later to remember, until now, his hand lifted slowly, hesitating just for a second before accepting the pendant, his fingers closing around it like they were holding something more than metal, something that carried time, debt, and a truth he had spent years avoiding. He did not thank her, not because he was ungrateful, but because the word felt too small for what had just been placed in his hand. Ayanna watched him for a moment longer, then gave a slight nod, not formal, not distant, just enough to mark the moment as complete. She turned then, stepping past him without hesitation, moving through the space the crowd had opened without ever asking for it. No one stopped her, no one reached out, because whatever power had held her there before no longer existed in the same way. It had dissolved into something quieter, something that did not need to be enforced. Ethan stood where he was, the pendant resting in his palm, the rope hanging loose at his side, watching as she walked toward the edge of town where the dust met the open land. And for the first time in a long while, the lines he had drawn in his mind between who belonged and who did not began to blur, not erased, not forgotten, just less certain than they had been before. Behind him, the town slowly began to move again, voices returning in low murmurs, doors creaking open, life resuming its usual shape. But something underneath it had shifted, something that would not be spoken of directly, yet would linger in the way people looked at each other, in the pauses between decisions, in the quiet understanding that sometimes the right thing does not arrive loud or clear, it arrives quietly, carried by someone willing to stand still when everyone else keeps moving. The sun had begun its slow descent when Ethan Cole finally moved again, the heat easing just enough to let the wind breathe through the town, carrying with it the faint scent of dry grass and distant water. He stood alone now near the edge of the square, most of the people having drifted back into their routines as if nothing had happened, yet not quite the same as before. The rope still hung from his hand, forgotten but not released, while the silver pendant rested heavier in his palm than any piece of metal had a right to be. He turned it once between his fingers, watching how the light caught along its worn edges, tracing marks that spoke of years, of hands that had held it long before his, of a path that had crossed his life without him knowing. And for a moment he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to listen, because there are times when the past does not speak in words, only in the weight of things. Returned, behind him, a voice called his name, hesitant, uncertain. It was the sheriff, standing a few yards back, hat in hand now, instead of on his head, a small detail that said more than anything he might have spoken aloud. Ethan did not turn immediately, giving the moment space. Then he glanced over his shoulder. The sheriff shifted his stance, clearing his throat like a man stepping into unfamiliar ground. "I did not know," he said quietly, not explaining what he meant, because both of them understood. Ethan gave a slight nod, not forgiving, not condemning, just acknowledging the truth as it was. "Most men do not," he replied, his voice steady, and that was all that needed to be said. The sheriff lowered his gaze for a second, then nodded in return, something unspoken passing between them, not agreement, but recognition, the kind that settles deeper than words. Ethan turned back toward the open land where Ayanna had disappeared, the horizon stretching wide and quiet, untouched by the weight of the town's mistakes. He could not see her anymore, but the space she had walked through still felt different, like a path that had been cleared not by force, but by something steadier, something that left no mark yet changed everything it touched. He slipped the pendant into his pocket, not hiding it, but keeping it close, as if it belonged there now more than anywhere else. His horse waited a short distance away, reins loose, head lowered, patient in the way animals are when they trust the man who holds them. Ethan walked toward it slowly, boots pressing soft prints into the dust that would not last past the next wind. He paused beside the saddle, resting a hand against the worn leather, then looked back once more at the town, at the wooden platform now empty, at the people moving through their day with quieter steps, at the sheriff standing still, as if thinking through something he had never questioned before. And in that glance Ethan saw it clearly, not the town as it had been, but as it might become, shaped not by loud decisions or forceful hands, but by moments like the one that had just passed, small, quiet, and impossible to ignore once seen. He mounted the horse without hurry, settling into the saddle with the ease of someone who had spent more time riding than standing still. The leather creaked softly beneath him, familiar, grounding. He turned the horse toward the road leading out of town, the same road Ayanna had taken, though he did not urge the animal forward just yet. Instead, he sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle around him again, because some silences carry answers if you are willing to wait. And then, with a gentle pull of the reins, he guided the horse into motion, hooves striking a slow rhythm against the earth, steady, unforced, as the town receded behind him, shrinking into the distance, not forgotten, but no longer holding the same weight. Ahead, the land opened wide, rolling hills fading into the horizon, the kind of space that does not judge, does not remember, only continues. And somewhere out there, beyond where the dust met the sky, walked a woman who had carried silence stronger than any accusation. A woman who had returned something he did not know he had lost. Ethan rode on without looking back again, the pendant warm against his chest now, the rope left behind in the square where it no longer belonged. And as the wind picked up, brushing against his coat, carrying away the last traces of the town's noise, one thought remained, quiet and certain, that sometimes the line between right and wrong is not drawn by law or by crowd, but by the moment a man chooses to stand still when everything around him demands he move. And in that choice, something greater than judgment takes root, something that does not need to be spoken to be understood. The road stretched ahead in long, quiet miles, the kind that gave a man too much time to think if he let it, and Ethan Cole had spent years learning how not to. But the pendant in his pocket made that harder than usual. It rested there like it belonged, like it had been waiting for him longer than he had known. His horse moved at an easy pace, hooves pressing steady into the dry earth, the rhythm familiar, grounding, yet something beneath that rhythm had shifted, something he could not ride away from no matter how far the land opened in front of him. The sun dipped lower, turning the sky into long bands of amber and dust, shadows stretching across the hills like quiet reminders of things left behind. He should have kept going, should have let the town shrink into nothing the way he always did. But after a few miles he slowed, then stopped entirely, the horse lifting its head slightly, ears turning back as if sensing the change before Ethan admitted it himself. He exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the horizon, not searching for trouble, not expecting anything, just feeling the weight of a choice he had not finished making. Because what happened back there was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a question he had avoided most of his life. He turned in the saddle, looking back along the road he had come from. The town no longer visible, only a faint line of dust marking where it sat beyond the rise. And for a long moment he stayed that way, caught between leaving and understanding. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the pendant, holding it up to the fading light. The silver caught the last of the sun, glinting softly, not bright, not demanding, just present, like a truth that did not need to shout to be heard. He turned it in his fingers, tracing the worn edges again. And this time the memory did not come in fragments. It came whole, a small cabin, dim light filtering through a window, his mother lying still but not afraid, her voice steady as she spoke about people who had nothing yet gave everything. People who did not see strangers as enemies. People who believed that kindness was not something you traded, but something you carried. And for the first time since that memory had taken root, Ethan understood what she had meant, not as a story, but as something real, something that had reached him years later through a woman who had stood silent under a rope and did not ask for anything in return. His grip tightened slightly around the pendant, not in anger, not in regret, but in recognition, the kind that settles deeper than either. The horse shifted beneath him, impatient in the quiet way animals are when they sense stillness lasting too long. Ethan lowered the pendant slowly, slipping it back into his pocket, but this time it felt different, not like something he carried, but something that carried him forward in a way he had not planned. He turned the horse again, not back toward the town, but toward the direction Ayana had taken, the land there less traveled, marked by faint paths rather than worn roads. He did not urge the horse into speed. He let it move naturally, following the subtle signs left in the dust, the kind you only notice if you are not in a hurry. A scuff here, a lighter patch of disturbed earth there, signs of someone who walked steady and did not try to hide it. The sky darkened slowly as he rode, the air cooling, carrying the scent of sage and distant water. Somewhere ahead, a faint movement caught his eye, not close, not clear, just enough to suggest he was not alone out here. Ethan slowed again, not cautious, not tense, just aware, because out here awareness mattered more than anything else. The shape moved once more against the horizon, then stilled, and for a moment he wondered if it was her, if he had caught up to something he was not sure he deserved to find. He did not call out, did not push forward. He simply rode on at the same steady pace, giving the distance the respect it deserved. Because some things are not meant to be rushed, they are meant to be met when both sides are ready. The light faded further, the first stars beginning to appear above the wide open sky. And in that quiet space between day and night, Ethan felt it clearly, not as a thought, not as a decision, but as something simpler, something that had been building since the moment he stepped onto that platform. He was no longer riding away from what he had seen. He was riding toward understanding it. And that was a different kind of journey entirely, one that did not measure distance in miles, but in the spaces between who a man was and who he chose to become. The horse continued forward, steady and sure, and somewhere ahead, whether near or far, walked a woman who had changed the weight of silence without ever raising her voice. And for the first time in a long while, Ethan did not feel the need to outrun that silence. He let it ride with him, quiet, constant, and guiding in a way he was only beginning to understand. The figure ahead did not move when Ethan Cole closed the distance. It stood where the fading light met the earth, still as if it had been there long before he arrived. And for a moment he wondered if it was not a person at all, but something shaped by shadow and distance. But then the wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage and smoke, and he knew. He slowed his horse to a near stop, letting the last few yards stretch longer than they needed to. Not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the space between two lives that had crossed once already and were not meant to collide carelessly again. Ayana Red Hawk stood with her back to him, her silhouette outlined against the dim horizon, her posture the same as it had been in the square, steady, grounded, as if the land itself recognized her and made room without question. Ethan did not speak right away. He let the silence settle, because out here silence was not empty, it was a language. And if you spoke too quickly, you risked saying the wrong thing. The horse shifted beneath him, then stilled again, sensing the quiet tension that was not quite tension at all, just awareness. After a long moment, Ayana turned, not startled, not defensive, simply acknowledging what she had already known. Her eyes met his, and in that gaze there was no surprise, only a calm understanding that he would come, not because he owed her, but because something in him would not allow him to ride away without knowing why. "You followed," she said, her voice low, carrying easily in the open air, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement. Ethan inclined his head slightly, not denying it, not explaining it. "I did not understand," he replied, the words plain, unguarded, and for a brief second something softened in her expression, not enough to be called a smile, but enough to shift the air between them. "Understanding comes when it is ready," she said, her gaze drifting past him for a moment, as if measuring something beyond sight. Then returning, "You are early." The words lingered, quiet, but certain, and Ethan felt them settle in a place he had not expected. "Early for what?" he asked, not impatient, not demanding, just honest. Ayana stepped closer, not closing the distance entirely, but enough that the space between them no longer felt like a barrier. "For knowing that not all debts are paid with anger," she said, and for a moment the wind carried the words away, then brought them back again, softer, heavier. Ethan's hand moved unconsciously toward his pocket where the pendant rested, his fingers brushing against the fabric. "You gave this to me," he said, drawing it out again, the silver catching the faint light of the rising stars. Ayana looked at it, not with longing, not with regret, but with recognition. "It was never mine to keep," she replied. "My grandmother carried it. Before her another. It was given to the woman you remember, not as payment, but as trust." Ethan studied her face, searching for something that might explain the weight behind her words. She did not look away, did not shield herself behind silence this time. "Your mother did not die alone," she continued, her voice steady. "She was not afraid when she left this world, because she believed her son would one day understand what she could not explain." The night grew quieter around them, the stars sharpening overhead, and for a moment Ethan felt the ground beneath him shift in a way no storm had ever caused, not because of fear, but because something he had carried for years without knowing had finally found its place. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him like something released. "I thought I lost her before I could learn anything she tried to teach me," he said, the words quieter now, not meant for the land, only for the space between them. Ayana shook her head once, gently. "No lesson is lost, only delayed," she said, and the simplicity of it struck deeper than anything else could have. Ethan looked down at the pendant again, then closed his hand around it, not gripping, just holding, as if acknowledging that it no longer belonged to the past alone. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through the grass, carrying with it the sound of something distant, perhaps water, perhaps movement, something alive beyond what they could see. Ayana turned her head slightly, listening, then looked back at him. "There are paths you can still choose," she said, not telling him which, not guiding him, just reminding him that the choice existed. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding that this was not a moment of decision, but a moment of clarity, and those were not the same thing. He slipped the pendant back into his pocket, then rested his hand lightly against the saddle horn. "You did not need to come back to that town," he said, and this time there was something closer to curiosity in his voice. Ayana's gaze shifted briefly toward the direction of the distant settlement, then back to him. "Some places must be reminded of what they forgot," she answered, and with that, the space between them settled again into something quiet and steady, not unfinished, but not concluded either, just a moment held between what had been and what would come next. And in that stillness, under a sky that stretched wider than either of them could claim, Ethan understood that whatever road he chose from here would no longer be guided by what he had been told to believe, but by what he had finally begun to see. The night settled deeper across the land, the last trace of sun gone, leaving only the quiet glow of stars stretched wide above them. And in that stillness, the world felt larger, older, as if it had been waiting for moments like this long before either of them were born. Ethan Cole remained in the saddle, but did not move. Not yet, his hand resting loosely near his pocket where the pendant lay, the weight of it no longer unfamiliar, no longer something to question, but something to carry with purpose he was only beginning to understand. Iona Red Hawk stood a few paces away, her presence steady as the ground beneath her, her eyes no longer searching him, no longer measuring, but simply observing, as if she had already seen the choice forming inside him and knew it did not need to be rushed. The wind moved softly through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint sound of distant water flowing somewhere beyond the rise, a quiet reminder that the land continued whether men understood it or not. Ethan finally broke the silence, not with urgency, not with doubt, but with a question that had been forming since he left the town. What happens to them now? He asked, not meaning the crowd, not meaning the sheriff, but something broader, something that reached beyond a single moment. Iona did not answer immediately. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, where the darkness met the earth in a line that seemed endless. Then she spoke. They will remember what they felt today, even if they do not speak of it. Her voice calm, certain. Memory does not need permission to stay. Ethan considered that, the idea settling into him slowly, not as comfort, but as truth. And he knew she was right, because even now he could feel it in himself. The shift that had taken place, the quiet change that would not leave no matter how far he rode. The kind of change that did not demand attention but altered everything it touched. He glanced down at his hands, calloused, worn from years of work and distance. Hands that had built, fought, survived, but had rarely paused long enough to question the path they followed. And now they felt different, not weaker, not stronger, just aware. He looked back at Iona. There are more towns like that one, he said, not as a complaint, not as a warning, just stating what both of them already knew. She nodded once. There are, and there will be, her tone unchanged, and that did not trouble her, not in the way it might have troubled another, because she understood something he was only beginning to see. That change did not come from stopping every wrong. It came from standing in the right place when it mattered. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him with a sense of clarity he had not expected to find out here in the dark. He shifted slightly in the saddle, then swung one leg over and dismounted, boots meeting the ground with a soft, steady sound. He did not close the distance entirely, but he stepped forward enough that they stood on equal ground now, not separated by height or position, just two people in the same quiet space. You said some places need reminding, he said, his voice low, measured. Iona met his gaze again, steady as ever. Yes, she replied, and some people need to be the reminder. The words were simple, but they carried weight, not as instruction, not as expectation, but as possibility. Ethan let that settle, not rushing to accept it, not pushing it away, just allowing it to exist, because for the first time in a long while, he did not feel the need to decide everything at once. He reached into his pocket again, pulling out the pendant, holding it between them, the silver catching starlight now instead of sun, quieter, more subtle, like the truth it represented. This was not given for nothing, he said, not asking, just acknowledging. Iona's eyes softened slightly, the smallest shift, enough to be felt more than seen. Nothing given in kindness is ever for nothing, she answered. It carries forward, sometimes in ways we do not choose. Ethan closed his hand around the pendant again, then slipped it back into his pocket, this time with a sense of acceptance that did not need words. The wind moved again, brushing past them, carrying the cool of night deeper into the land. Somewhere in the distance, a low sound echoed, perhaps an animal moving through the dark, perhaps something else, but it did not disturb the quiet between them. It only reminded them that the world was still moving, still unfolding beyond this moment. Iona stepped back then, not retreating, not leaving, just shifting her place in the space, as if signaling that whatever needed to be said had been said. Ethan nodded once, a small gesture, but one that held understanding, not agreement, not obligation, just recognition of what had passed between them. He turned toward his horse, placing a hand on the saddle, then paused, glancing back at her one last time, not to hold her there, not to ask for anything more, just to see her clearly in this moment before it moved on. And she stood as she always had, steady, quiet, part of the land and Separate from it all at once, he mounted again without hurry, settling into the saddle as naturally as breathing. And when he turned the horse this time, it was not away, not entirely, but forward, toward whatever road would come next. And though he did not know exactly where it would lead, he understood something he had not before, that the path was no longer something he followed without question. It was something he shaped with each choice he made. And somewhere behind him, beneath the wide sky and the quiet stars, stood a woman who had never needed to raise her voice to change the direction of a man's life, only to stand still long enough for him to see what had been there all along. The horse moved forward at a steady pace, each step measured, each breath visible in the cool night air, and Ethan Cole did not look back this time, not because there was nothing left behind, but because what mattered had already settled into him. The land stretched wide under the stars, silent but not empty, carrying stories older than any town, older than the lines men tried to draw across it. And as he rode, the weight in his pocket felt less like a burden and more like a direction, something quiet guiding him without pulling, the kind of guidance that did not force a man forward but waited for him to choose. The wind brushed against his coat, carrying the faint scent of sage and distant water, and for a while there was nothing else, just the rhythm of hooves, the soft creak of leather, the open space that asked no questions, but did not let a man forget his answers either. After a mile, maybe two, Ethan slowed again, not because something was wrong, but because something felt unfinished. He turned his head slightly, listening, not with his ears alone, but with that awareness that had sharpened since the square. And then he heard it, faint, distant, the sound of voices carried low across the land, not shouting, not urgent, just present. He guided the horse toward it, slow and deliberate, not seeking trouble, not expecting it, only following what was there. The ground shifted under hoof, softer now, marked by more than one set of tracks, not hidden, not careless, just real. As the distance closed, shapes began to form against the dim light, figures, standing near a low fire, their silhouettes steady, their posture calm, not a threat, not a welcome, simply a presence. Ethan did not stop, but he did not rush either. He let the horse approach at the same even pace, giving them time to see him, to understand. He came without urgency. One of the figures turned slightly, then another, and though he could not see their faces clearly, he could feel their attention settle on him, not sharp, not hostile, just aware. He drew the reins gently, bringing the horse to a stop a few yards away, enough distance to show respect, enough closeness to be seen. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the ground, and for a moment no one spoke. Then a voice came from the group, older, steady. "You carry something that is not new to you." The words were simple, but they landed with precision. Ethan did not reach for his pocket, did not show the pendant. He only nodded once, because there was no need to explain what they already understood. The figure stepped forward slightly, the light catching part of his face, lined with age but not weakened by it, only shaped. "You met her," he said, not asking. Ethan nodded again. "Yes." The man inclined his head, as if that answered more than the words themselves. The others remained where they were, silent, watching, not judging, not welcoming, simply witnessing, the way people do when they understand that a moment belongs to itself and does not need to be interrupted. Ethan shifted slightly in the saddle, then dismounted, boots touching the ground with a quiet finality. He stood there for a moment, not stepping closer, not stepping back, just present. The fire crackled softly, sending small sparks upward into the night, disappearing as quickly as they rose. "You followed her path," the older man said, his voice calm, not surprised. Ethan glanced briefly toward the dark beyond the firelight, then back. "I followed what I did not understand," he replied, and for a moment something like approval passed through the stillness, not spoken, not shown, just felt. The man gave a small nod. "That is how understanding begins," he said, not as instruction, but as truth. Ethan's hand moved slightly toward his pocket again, resting there, not pulling the pendant free, just acknowledging its presence. "She said some places need reminding," he added, and this time there was something quieter in his voice, something closer to reflection than question. The older man's gaze held his for a long second, then shifted toward the others, then back. And some people remember longer than others, he said, his tone unchanged, as if the words carried no weight beyond what they already were. Ethan looked at the group again, at the fire, at the way they stood without urgency, without tension, and for the first time he understood what Ayana had meant, not in words, but in the way they existed, steady, patient, not trying to change the world all at once, only standing where it mattered. The wind moved through the clearing, brushing against the flames, bending them without putting them out, and in that small movement, something settled inside him again, not a decision, not a plan, just a quiet certainty that whatever came next would not be the same as what came before. He did not need to ask what to do, did not need to be told where to go, because the path was already forming beneath his feet, shaped by choices he had only just begun to understand. The older man stepped back slightly, giving space again, the moment complete without needing to be closed. And Ethan stood there a second longer, feeling the warmth of the fire, the cool of the night, the weight in his pocket, all of it part of the same truth now. Then he turned, not away, not entirely, but forward again, toward a road that no longer belonged to habit, but to intention. And as he reached for the reins, he knew one thing with quiet certainty, that whatever distance he traveled from here would not be measured in miles alone, but in the space between who he had been and who he was finally becoming. The fire behind him dimmed as Ethan Cole stepped away, not because it burned any less, but because he no longer stood within its circle, and that difference mattered more than the distance itself. The horse shifted as he approached, lifting its head slightly, sensing the quiet change in him the way animals often do before men understand it themselves. He rested a hand along the animal's neck, fingers pressing gently into warm muscle, grounding himself in something simple, something real. Before pulling himself back into the saddle, the leather creaked softly beneath his weight, a familiar sound that now carried a different kind of meaning, not routine, not escape, but continuation. He turned the horse once more, not looking toward the fire again, not needing to, because what had been given, there was not something left behind. It moved with him now, quiet and steady, like the rhythm of his own breath. The land opened again as he rode, the low glow of the fire fading into darkness, replaced by the pale stretch of moonlight that traced the hills and valleys ahead. The path was not clear, not marked by signs or worn tracks, but that no longer unsettled him, because clarity did not come from the road. It came from the choice to walk it, or in this case, to ride it. The night carried a stillness that felt different from before, not empty, not waiting, but aware, as if the land itself recognized the shift that had taken place. And though nothing visible had changed, everything felt altered in a way that could not be reversed. After some time, he slowed again, not out of uncertainty, but because something ahead drew his attention, a faint outline against the silver light, a structure, small, worn, standing alone where the ground dipped slightly toward a narrow stream. Ethan guided the horse closer, the sound of water becoming clearer, a soft, steady flow over stone, the kind that did not demand notice but rewarded those who listened. The cabin came into view slowly, its wood aged but intact, a single lantern flickering near the door, its glow weak but persistent. He stopped a short distance away, studying it, not with suspicion, but with the quiet awareness that had grown stronger with each mile. This was not a place marked on any map he had followed, not a destination he had planned, and yet it felt like part of the same path, the same unfolding that had begun back in the square. He dismounted slowly, boots meeting the earth with a soft, deliberate sound. The horse remained still behind him, reins loose, trusting. Ethan stepped closer to the cabin, each movement measured, not cautious, but respectful. The lantern light flickered against the wood, casting shadows that shifted gently with the wind, and for a moment, he simply stood there, listening, the water, the wind, the quiet creak of old timber. Then a voice came from within, calm, steady. "You have come far enough for tonight." The words carried through the door without effort, not loud, not guarded, just certain. Ethan did not reach for the handle, did not step back. He only inclined his head slightly, acknowledging what was already understood. "I was not looking for this place," he said, his voice low, even. The door opened slowly, not with hesitation, but with intention. revealing an older woman standing just inside, her presence quiet but unmistakable, her eyes clear, steady in a way that spoke of time rather than age. She studied him for a moment, not judging, not questioning, just seeing. Most people never are, she replied, stepping aside just enough to allow space without inviting it. The lantern light caught her features more clearly now, lines shaped by years, but not worn down by them. Her gaze shifted briefly to his chest, as if she could see through the fabric to the weight he carried beneath, then back to his eyes. Ethan remained where he was, not stepping forward, not crossing the threshold, because he understood that some doors were not meant to be entered without knowing why. I met someone who knew my mother, he said, not as a question, not seeking confirmation, just placing the truth into the space between them. The woman nodded once, as if she had expected no less. And now you know more than you did before, she said, her tone unchanged. Ethan exhaled slowly, the breath carrying a weight that felt lighter than it had hours ago, but heavier in meaning. Not enough, he replied, and there was no frustration in it, only honesty. The woman's expression shifted slightly, not into a smile, but into something close to understanding. It is never enough at first, she said, stepping back toward the interior of the cabin, leaving the door open, the lantern light stretching outward into the night. You do not learn the whole truth in one place, or from one moment. Ethan looked at the open doorway, then at the land behind him, the wide darkness, the road that no longer felt like something he could simply leave, then back at the woman. I am not here to stay, he said, not as refusal, but as recognition of where he stood. She inclined her head slightly, as if that was exactly what she expected to hear. No, she replied, but you are here to understand that the road does not end when you leave a place. It only changes direction. The words settled into him with the same quiet certainty he had felt all night, not forcing anything, not demanding belief, just existing, waiting to be carried forward. Ethan nodded once, a small movement, but one that held acceptance, not of answers, but of the path itself. He stepped back then, not turning away immediately, but giving the moment the space it deserved. The woman watched him for a second longer, then closed the door gently, the lantern light dimming as it slipped behind wood, leaving him once again under the open sky. The sound of the stream continuing its quiet flow, unchanged, constant. He stood there for a moment, feeling the night settle around him, then turned, walking back to his horse, each step steady, each breath even. And as he mounted once more, guiding the animal forward into the dark, he understood something with a clarity that did not need to be spoken, that the journey he had begun was not about reaching a place, but about becoming someone who could see what had always been there, waiting in silence for him to notice it. The road carried him deeper into the quiet, and for the first time in years, Ethan Cole did not measure the distance by how far he had gone, but by how differently it felt to keep going. The horse moved steady beneath him, breath slow, untroubled, as if it too understood that the night was not something to pass through, but something to listen within. The stars above had shifted slightly, marking time in a way no man could argue with, and the land below followed its own rhythm, unchanged by what had happened in the town, unchanged by what had been revealed along the road. And yet Ethan knew that he was not the same man who had ridden into that square, not because something had been added to him, but because something had been uncovered, something that had always been there, but never given space to speak. After a while, the ground beneath the horse began to slope gently downward, the air cooling further, carrying the unmistakable scent of water, stronger now, clearer. Ethan guided the horse toward it, not searching for shelter, not seeking answers, just following the natural pull of the land. The sound of the stream grew louder, steady and patient, the kind of sound that did not rush and did not stop. When he reached it, he slowed the horse and dismounted, boots pressing into damp soil, softer than the dry earth he had traveled for miles. He led the horse closer, letting it drink, the animal lowering its head without hesitation, trusting the place, trusting him. Ethan stood beside it, one hand resting lightly against its neck, the other hanging loose at his side, his gaze fixed on the moving water, watching how it slipped over stone, bending around obstacles without breaking, without losing its direction. And for a long moment, he said nothing, thought nothing in words, only felt the quiet.